Hey everyone, it's Mark. Before we get the podcast started today, I wanted to jump on here first to say I hope all of you are having a wonderful holiday season so far. I hope you're excited and looking forward to a new year coming, and I hope you're getting to enjoy some time away from work, a time with family, a time to rest, and a time to catch up. And I also want to say thank you for being listeners of the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I really love doing this podcast, and I think we've had a really good year at it. For today's episode, we've got something really quite special. We're going to be focusing on a 64-page anthology graphic novel called unSeen, unHeard, Disability and Neurodivergence, which was a Kickstarter project that was published by an organization called Unseen Alchemy Publishing. It includes a dozen stories addressing different types of disability and neurodivergent conditions, told by creators who live with and experience those conditions. I'm really fortunate to have as my guest today Dr. Dominique White, who is a friend and a colleague of mine, and on behalf of both of us, I wanted to offer we are seeking to approach all of these stories that we're going to address today with respect, with an attitude of seeking better understanding of both the creators and the work that they're doing. And so if we make any stumbles along the way in terms of language that we use or in how we phrase a question or even raise a question that might be considered ignorant or offensive, I hope you'll please show us some grace there because we really do want to approach this with the utmost of respect. It is a wonderful collection of stories in the graphic format that we love so much here on this podcast, and I hope all of you are also able to take away something meaningful from this book and our discussion of it. Here's today's show.
Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Orenberger. I am so happy to be here with you, as always. And this week we've got something a little different from most of the books that we've done before. And I've got a special guest that I'm really excited to introduce. My guest today is a friend and a colleague of mine. She works at Arkansas State University as the head of their Access and Accommodations offices, the same office that might be referred to as the Disability Services Office on some other campuses. And she is also the proprietor of Beyond Barriers telehealth practice. It is my friend, Dr. Dominique White. Dominique, how are you today?
Good. How are you?
I am wonderful. And I'm excited that you agreed to do this book with me because I know this is an area that is uh, a big passion for you. It's an area where you have dedicated your career and a lot of service and your expertise. And I was really excited when this book first came out. I ought to introduce it. The book that we are going to be discussing today is called unSeen/unHeard, Disability and Neurodivergence. And this was a book that was produced through Kickstarter. And the idea of this project was something that just seemed like such a wonderful idea to me. And I want to read to you the pitch that they had on their Kickstarter page for this. First of all, there are three editors who are well experienced in the comics industry who have brought this to us. Anas Abdulak, Aubrey Jeppson, and C.K. Carpenter are the editors who helped put this project together. And it's a 64-page anthology comic that collects 12 slice of life, romance, sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short comics about dealing with disabilities or being neurodivergent. And then they had this on their Kickstarter page, and I thought it was a pretty nice synopsis, and I think worth reading to you. It says, "Why this anthology? It was vital to us that these stories about neurodivergent people and those with disabilities be told by people with those conditions. Similarly, creators with these conditions often find it difficult to make comics consistently, from financial barriers to constant interruptions to the creative process, because their energy must go to simply existing. As such, we wanted to produce this anthology to give those who might not usually get to tell their stories a platform to do so. The anthology covers a wide spectrum of conditions: AUDHD, ankylosing spondylitis, traumatic brain injury, dyslexia, spinal cord injury, misophonia associated with autism spectrum disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, Tourette's syndrome, blindness, fibromyalgia, CPTSD, and more. Furthermore, intersexuality and representation of other marginalized communities is a pillar of Unseen Alchemy publishing. As such, expect to see 2S LGBTQIA+ and BIOPOC representation in our stories.
I'm so glad you read that description because when I first started reading this, the first thing that came to mind is something you always talk about, or we always talk about in the disability community. Nothing about us without us is a statement that you would often hear. And I talk all the time, on campus and in general about how the media does not really always do a good job in representing disability in the appropriate light in terms of having folks with those experiences actually play the characters on TV and in movies and things like that. So this is exactly what they're talking about in a way.
Well, that's wonderful, and I thought reading this anthology gave a really interesting mind's eye into, not only people dealing with different struggles in their life and different disabilities that they have to work through as they
Yeah.
navigate the world, but also different voices. And so
Hmm.
some of the perspectives in this book were more positive. Some
Yeah.
of them were manifestly more frustrated.
Yeah.
Some of them felt like they also, kind of had a thing or two to say to the people around them who are, in their lives and
Sure.
like wanted people to know and understand better how they feel when people are acting or reacting toward them.
Yeah, and I mean that's the reality of living with disability, right? Is that it's not always pretty. It's not you can't always flower it up, you know. You can't always find the positive because some days are just super frustrating and dealing with people who don't understand and dealing with systems that you have to navigate. It's just super infuriating and some days you don't have a positive spin on that and some days you wake up and you find the good, and so it is a very complex thing to have to navigate. And so I think this anthology shows every side of that.
Yeah, yeah, I was so happy with this. Dominique, for the benefit of our listeners, would you please talk a little bit about the work that you do both with Arkansas State University and also in your private counseling practice?
Yeah, for sure. So we just got to talking, right? It didn't even get to that part. So I oversee the Disability Services Office, or what is known as the Disability Services Office at Arkansas State. And what that means is that I facilitate accommodations for every kind of student navigating any kind of disability condition. So that could be mental health conditions, that could be health related things like diabetes, that could be something like Tourette's, that could be visual impairments, hearing impairments, all kinds of things, that could be physical disabilities. So anything that you think is going to hinder you showing up at your best capacity in college, we can make accommodations for. So that's what I do for the students on the A-State campus and for A-State online students as well. And then in my private practice is where I do therapy with individuals of all kinds of backgrounds, navigating some of the same issues, depression, anxiety, navigating disability, whether it's something you're born with or something you acquire over time, because that's a completely different experience. And so I work with adult clients, navigating all kinds of things in life and just trying to help them walk through what that can look like for their lives in the most positive capacity that they can muster. Because again, as we talked about, sometimes it's not all wonderful, but what kind of meaning can we find from whatever experiences we're navigating? So that's what I do, part-time private practice work.
Dominique, of course, all kinds of people can benefit from counseling and
Yeah.
mental health therapy, but you have chosen to specifically focus your practice on the intersection of disability and mental health counseling. And
Yeah.
can you please talk to us a little bit about how you chose to do that? I'd be interested to know. I don't think we've ever talked about this. how you focused on that at all in your training, in your education, and then what different types of approaches you need when working with the disability community as opposed to individuals without disabilities.
Yeah, great questions. So, the reason why I focus on disability population in therapy is twofold or multi-layered. One, of course, it's the professional work that I've chosen to do with my life, and so of course I have a heart for that population. Secondly, I also identify as a disabled person, and so in my own lived experience, I kind of understand from my vantage point, what it's like to be navigating an identity that a lot of people don't recognize or don't feel is as important or as valuable as it is. I think, and I tell this to people all the time, I identify as woman, I identify as Black, I identify as straight, and I also identify as disabled. And I can't separate any of those identities from one another. So each of them is just as significant for me in my life. And that's not everybody's experience, but that's my experience. But what I have noticed a lot of time is in the mental health space, disability is not really given the same weight as some of these other things that people might be navigating. And it's just as significant or just as important. And so that's why I chose to focus my practice in that way. And in terms of education, or training. So, one of the degrees that I sought actually after I started working at Access and Accommodation Services. So, I didn't have this to begin with. I started out with a degree in clinical mental health counseling. And then once I started working with students with disabilities, it just made sense for me to also add that degree onto what I had. And so I went back to school and got a master's in rehabilitation counseling from UALR in Little Rock. And so when I say rehab counseling, a lot of people think of drug and alcohol counseling, right? But rehab counseling has many different facets, and one of them is disability. And so that's what my program focused on. And then, of course, to maintain those certifications and licensures, you have to do continuing ed and all those things. So I've done a lot of that work too.
If you were speaking to a group of other mental health counselors
Yeah.
and they were counselors who didn't focus specifically on populations of individuals with disabilities, but some of their clientele might be individuals with disabilities, likely are. What would you want them to know about what they need to take into consideration or different approaches they might think about when working with those types of clients?
Yeah. So I would start really with the basics and say in your intake process, when you're gathering information about a potential client or a new client, there needs to be some questions in there related to disability and if they identify as a person with a disability and what that means for them. Because what that means for one person and what that means for another could be completely different. But I think sometimes just the question in general is missing from a lot of just the intake process and intake paperwork. I would also say this, even if you know that a person or a potential client is a person with a disability, you don't want to make that the entire reason why they must be coming to therapy. And you don't want to make your session solely about that, but you also don't want to dismiss that, right? So there has to be a balance in that. And I am, again, identify as a person with a disability, but there's so many more facets to my life than that. And so what brings me to therapy very well might not be that at all, but it is a part of my experience. But also, I don't want to sit in a therapy practice or space where that's not brought up at all, or it's just dismissed as unimportant. So how do you balance those two things out? And I think, at least from the research that I have done, many people who identify as disabled and go to therapy feel one or two ways. Like that part of their life is completely ignored, or that is the sole focus of what their therapist, talks about in therapy. But that's not the sole focus of who they are as a person. And so both of those extremes are probably not the right things to do.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I got to imagine that it takes probably just a lot of repetition and a lot of working with different patients to really sort of figure out how to strike that right balance.
Yeah. And I think I think your biggest thing is to listen to the client. And if they're constantly talking about it or bringing it up as a frustration in their life or as something significant in their life, point that out in session and go with them wherever they take you when they're talking about what it is they're talking about. But if that's not something that they ever bring up as an important significant thing or as a thing that is a hindrance in their life, then you don't continue to focus on whatever it is they're giving to you. And I think that's always a safe bet, is just to go where the client takes you.
Makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
As we get started into this anthology, which, there are 12 different stories here. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to address them all, and they are in all different manner of storytelling. One is just a
Hmm.
poem that goes on for several pages, and the art itself reveals a lot of the emotion that the
Yeah.
author seems to be working through. One was just a one-page sort of look inside the person's mind, and then
Hmm.
others, of course, were told in different aspects where different ways that they represented disability
Yeah.
visually that I thought were really creative and added perspective. And we'll talk about some of those as we get through them. We've picked out about 4 or 5 that we wanted to speak to specifically. And so as we get into that, I'll call out the names of the writers and artists and color artists and letterers who participated in putting each of those stories together as well. But as we begin, there was something that struck me about this project a little bit, and I hope maybe you can help me with some insight.
Mm.
The work that I do, and of course, you and I work together on disability questions when there's a legal aspect that comes
Yeah,
into
sure.
play, and probably more of the work that I do dealing with individuals with disabilities deals with employee accommodations,
Mm,
which I tend to
hmm.
work directly with our human resources offices for. But when working through those things, and whenever I get a chance to offer a training on like how the Americans with Disabilities Act affects employers, affects institutions who are offering public accommodations, I always like to hit on the point that the so often overlooked aspect of disability is the invisible disability,
Yeah.
and that being an area that gets ignored or I think people are more afraid to address. I think there's a level of comfort maybe that people have when trying to help someone or work with someone who is navigating a disability when it is something that is obvious. If the person is in
Hmm.
a wheelchair or the person uses, special types of braces or a cane to get around,
Hmm.
it's kind of easy to address those things. Now, you might not, individuals without disabilities might sometimes fumble through those conversations a little bit, but at the same time, at least it's like, well, this is something that can't be overlooked. But when you're dealing with somebody who has one of those invisible types of disabilities, whether that is mental health or
Hmm.
whether that is several of the conditions that we'll talk about today, it's harder to know how to address, I think.
Yes, absolutely. It's not only hard to address, even as a person working with students navigating those disabilities and having to also work with faculty in explaining why this is important, right? If you can't see those disabilities, it's often hard to navigate those conversations. And to be honest, it's hard for individuals to even ask for support in the first place, who have invisible disabilities, because you already are coming to the conversation thinking people won't understand as much as they understand, or people won't empathize as much as they empathize potentially with folks who have visible things that you can see.
For this anthology, Unseen, unHeard, the subtitle was Disability and Neurodivergence. And I actually found that title to be interesting in
Mm.
that I would have thought of neurodivergence as a category of disability. And I think that's probably correct. But I understand that maybe in putting together this anthology, the editors wanted to really focus on that area in addition to physical disabilities. But am I correct in sort of classifying that in my mind?
Yes, yes, and there is some debate on that as well. So, yes, you would hear when you hear neurodivergent or something akin to that, you think of certain types of conditions, right? Like Tourette's and like autism and like ADHD. But I mean, in actuality, neurodivergent or neurotypical is just anything that is not typical. If you really
Okay.
just get that to the bare bones of the definition, right? And so in our society, disability is not typical. So a lot of things could fit under that umbrella, if you will, even learning disabilities, because again, neurodivergent is anything that diverges from the typical way of being. And so there's some debate or conversation, I won't say debate, but conversation around neurodivergent being this very limited kind of category of conditions versus just disability as a whole because it diverges from the norm, quote unquote.
That makes sense. Well, let's jump into it and talk
Yeah,
about some of these stories. And, when you sent me the ones that you thought would be good to focus on, or the ones that stood out to you most, you put them in order that they appear in the book. Is there
sure.
one that you wanted to start with, or a story that you thought, really stood out the most?
Well, let me just first of all say that it was hard to pick, to be honest, just a
Yeah.
few. And also, let me say that this is my first time ever really diving into reading a book like this. So I appreciated just the newness of it. But we can just start from the way that they're listed and just go from there, I think.
Well, that sounds great. Then let's start with the very first story here in this anthology, focusing on two characters named Cal and Marty. And this story is called Terminal Vibration. And the writing and art were both done in this case by the same individual. The creator's name is Chuck Howitt-Lease.
When I read it, the first thing that came to my mind is someone navigating autism and ADHD, or one or the other, or both. And I say both potentially because a lot of times people are often navigating coexisting conditions. So it's not just one thing. So I thought of a person with autism and ADHD and just having trouble navigating that on a day to day basis and being overstimulated and having your mind just never stopping and never turning off, and how exhausting that has to be for the person living with it and for their partner and people in their life, and trying to understand but not really getting it because you don't have to live in it, and so therefore there's gonna be a wall there, because as much as you try to understand and try to be supportive, you don't have to live in that body and in that brain every day. So there's a piece of it that you're never going to be able to get.
Yeah. So this particular story is really presented in more of a show, not tell approach.
Hmm.
And as we started talking, you talked about what types of conditions it seemed that the author was
Right.
communicating here, and it's never spelled out here. And I suppose for anyone who is in this person's life, it's not necessarily necessary to have a
Yeah.
title or a name to know what this condition is. Just we get to experience here life through this character's eyes.
Yeah, I was going to say it's not necessary to have the diagnosis per se, but you know what that person is experiencing from day to day. And so what can you do to make that easier or to be helpful is kind of all you really need to know, because we can say that it's whatever the diagnosis might be, but how everybody experiences that can look completely different anyway.
Sure. And so the way the creator here chooses to reveal to us what his life experience is like is we see a man just, walking down a street, looks like he's carrying a sack of groceries or something like that. And I do notice, though, that he has glasses on that are tinted. And as he's walking, a car's driving by, other people are walking past him, and he starts to become alarmed, or at least
Mhm.
that's the way he's depicting himself. Not that he is scared, but that he's agitated by what he's experiencing. And the things that he's experiencing are the sounds of cars walking past, the chewing of chewing gum from the other pedestrians that are on the street. And as he depicts this, you see almost like stimulus is shooting in through his eyes and kind of out the other side, like he's experiencing something that can be pretty overwhelming. And as he continues on the street, and this is all revealed in the course of one page, we move
Mhm.
to a panel where it's like there is so much stimulus around him that someone else without his conditions might not even notice, but it is completely overwhelming to him to the point where he then gets back to his house. And I think I referred to his partner as Marty a minute ago. It's Maddie. But as
Uh-huh.
as Cal opens the door to his house and Maddie is standing there to sort of welcome him home, Cal has to sort of wave him off and
Mm.
say, "No, not now. I'll be back." And then goes into a room and closes the door by himself.
Yeah.
And you can see with Maddie that he has some understanding, but also seems to feel helpless. He's
Sure.
knocking on the door saying, "Just tell me what's wrong. I want to help you." And obviously, this is not going to be the first time this experience has taken place. But
Sure.
as we go in, Cal gives us an idea. The character Cal gives us an idea of what is on the other side of this door. And
Mm.
it's not, we're not looking at the physical room he's actually entering into, but rather it's a depiction of a woods. And so this is his quiet space, and the agitation from all that outside stimulus is depicted as purple and yellow light that's kind of like trailing off of him. And as he walks deeper and deeper into the woods, there's less and less of that to the
Yeah.
point where finally he gets deep enough into this woods that it's quiet again for him. Once his mind has finally quieted, Cal comes back out of the room, and he's finally able to talk to Maddie. And Maddie is expressing how, he says, "I love you,
Yeah.
and I want to help, and I hope you know I love you." And Cal says, "Sometimes." And you can see that Maddie's, expression is kind of crestfallen here. And
Mhm.
it seems like he's going to be saying, "Sometimes I know you love me," but it's not. He carries on. He says, "Sometimes I wish you didn't, so that I could just
Mm.
give up and stay inside there forever." And you can tell that in addition to grappling with all of the stress of that stimulus that had overwhelmed him so much,
Yeah.
Cal is also at this point dealing with, what looks like a depression. He's sad
Absolutely.
about this because
Yeah.
he knows that Maddie loves him. And
Mhm.
then eventually, as he starts to go back by himself into this room, Maddie stops him and goes in with him.
Yeah.
And they walk in together. And now Maddie and Cal are walking hand in hand through this forest, which, by the way, was depicted in black and white earlier when Cal was walking through it by himself. And now the artist has added a bunch of color to this wood scene.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just sit down together on this log. And Maddie's telling him, "We'll get through it."
We'll get
And,
through it. Yeah.
Cal is apologizing. But it's
Mhm.
such a sweet way to end that story.
It is, and I think about the colors that you mentioned, like in the gray and in the black and white, it could feel like just you're just weighed down by all of this stimuli and all of this overwhelm, and you don't know what to do, and you're weighed down by your own mind. And even though the person that you're in love with or whomever it is can't do anything to help you necessarily, just the fact that they're there is kind of a
Yeah.
light. And that's where the color comes in, is that sometimes we don't really need somebody to fix it because there is no fixing, but you just being
Mhm.
present and there is helpful.
Absolutely. You
Yeah.
know, I am a person who the thought of putting someone else out or acting in a way that I feel like could be taken as rude to someone else is
Mm-hmm.
distressing to me. Like
Yeah.
it really it bothers me probably more than it should when I
Uh-huh.
feel like I have inconvenienced somebody or stood in the way of them enjoying their life somehow. And I
Sure.
felt like when Cal came back out from his quiet space and started to look so sad, I mean, I read that, as something that hits very close to home, where it's like he did what he had to do to survive in that moment by going
Mm.
into his quiet place. But at the same time, he knows that he probably hurts Maddie's feelings
Yeah,
by
for
disappearing
sure.
and not letting him in.
For sure. And it's so funny. I talk to clients about this all the time, in that don't want to be a burden. Right? Because you sometimes feel like disability is a burden, right? And you don't want to be a burden. So you don't tell people what's wrong, or you don't tell people this is what I need to function better, because you don't want to, again, just be a burden. But I often think about how many times people want to be there for you. Like, they want to make adjustments for you because they want you to participate in their life. Like,
Mhm.
if the alternative is that you not being present, you not participating in the dinner or whatever it is that they want you there for, if that's the alternative, people often want to make whatever adjustments you need because they love you enough to want you there and to want you present. And so sometimes we think that we're a burden, but really people want to show up for you because that's what you do in relationships, whether it's a friendship or family or whatever. You show up for people, and we deprive people of the ability to show up for us when we don't talk to them and when we don't say, this is where I'm struggling and this is what I need. You deprive people of the thing that they want to do, which is be a person that shows up for people.
Stories like this, I think, are also so helpful in reminding all of us of. I've referenced it a bunch of times on this podcast, but that little meme that you see where it shows the iceberg and you see the tip of it above the water, and then you see the giant iceberg underneath,
Uh-huh.
and it says what you see of people's life, what's actually going on in people's life. I think we all need reminders of that all the time. And I can
Yeah.
imagine if you're Maddie, no matter how much Maddie loves Cal, if Cal comes home every day and immediately, doesn't say hi, just kind of waves him off and goes straight
Mhm.
into this closet or bedroom or whatever this place is where he's alone, that, if Maddie has had a bad day,
Mhm.
that's probably hard to understand sometimes, especially when he doesn't get to see inside Cal's head.
Right.
And,
Right.
maybe you start to think to yourself at some point, like, well, is this really because Cal needs this time, or is it because Cal just doesn't want to see me right now?
Mhm.
A
Mhm.
person can have their own insecurities, I suppose, in that way.
Yeah.
And so for us to
Absolutely.
get the opportunity to see that massive amount of noise
Mm.
inside Cal's head, it gives us a better idea of, like, of course, I can't really understand what he dealt with right before he came home.
And if that was your everyday, eventually, even if you're the most like patient partner or patient person, that wears down your own psyche and mental health. If the person is not letting you in and giving you glimpses of what we saw in these pictures, some kind of way, you have to figure out how to voice that and how to show somebody what that looks like for them to have some level of understanding, because otherwise, like, after a while, like you were saying, if I were Maddie, I would be thinking, like, is it me? Or,
Yeah,
is this really, like, something about this is not working and we can't continue to go on like this if I don't have some kind of glimpse into what your reality is like, which means that you've got to
yeah,
be vulnerable enough to let me in that way, right?
yeah. Well, and frankly, that's also why depictions like we're seeing here in this anthology are such a good resource.
Mm-hmm.
In
Yeah.
that it can help someone in Maddie's position to it's just a visual reminder of,
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, this isn't just about me.
Yeah. And it also makes me think, when you just said that this is a visual reminder, sometimes like a person like Cal may not be able to express what it feels like, but they might have a book like this that say and say, "Can you read this?" And then after you read it, like, maybe we can have a conversation about it, cuz I really can't explain what it looks like in my brain, but it looks like this. So, like,
Mhm.
somebody in Cal's position could give this to a Maddie and say, read this. This is what it's like for me. And they explain it better than I ever could. And then maybe that starts that conversation.
Sure. Well, hey, let's talk about fries. That was the next story that you had pointed out, and one that I certainly would have picked as well as a story that we should focus on. This story was written by A.J. Camorlinga. The artist was Terry Blas. The color artist for this story was Harry Saxon. And then Aubrey Lynn Jeppson, one of the editors on this project, also did the lettering for this particular story.
Mm-hmm. This one I picked because it had so many layers, to be honest, when it came to disability. So in this story, you see their characters are Emilio and Adrian, and you see one of them basically stealing fries from another in the school cafeteria, right? And one of the characters is saying, I had these first, or I was gonna take these first. And so it turns into a big thing, and they get into a fight in the school cafeteria. And then they get sent to the principal's office and both get in trouble. And next thing you know, I'm skipping a lot here, so Mark, jump in anywhere you'd like. Next thing you know, the one of the characters isn't in school. I think it's Emilio, isn't in school for a couple of days, and everybody's like, "Where is he? What has happened?" And you discover that he was in an accident, and now he's a wheelchair user. And so Adrian, the character that was bullying him in the beginning, is kind of like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. And the school teacher is telling everyone, hey, we're going to have a lesson on disability etiquette, basically, because I want you all to know how to respond and how to behave when Emilio comes back to school. And everybody seems to take this to heart, especially Adrian. And he's like, you can tell that he feels kind of guilty and doesn't really know what to think or do when Emilio comes back to school. And then they kind of get to talking unexpectedly, the two characters, and realize that they have a lot in common, actually, including the fact that Adrian's mom has been a wheelchair user since he was like 6 or 7, very young. And so, in his own way, he understands what navigating a wheelchair is like in a society that's not really built for that. And he understands that from, being looking at his mom's struggles in her daily life. And so they kind of become friends at the end and realize that you have more in common than you do different. And he also, I think, Adrian as a character, learns why Emilio was taking the fries. He didn't have much money, and they struggled to eat, he and his family. And so, he was taking extra fries because he likely didn't know where his next meal was going to come from. So again, once Adrian opens up about his mom's experience, him and Emilio just develop a friendship, and you get to know more about each of the young men in this story. And so I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you talked about in the conversation that we had before we started looking at these stories specifically
Mm,
was that when you're dealing with a client, you are dealing with disability as one aspect of their life, not as their only identity and not as the only part of their life
yeah.
where they might be having stresses or things that lead to their need for mental health counseling.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In this case, few of those things that we learn about Emilio are, one, as you mentioned, that he seemed to be going for these fries for extra food because we learn
Mm-hmm.
that his family doesn't have much money.
Yep.
When they get called to the principal's office, Emilio's dad comes to pick him up. And his dad is speaking to him in Spanish and telling him, like, I had to leave my job to come and pick you up because you
Yep.
got into a fight at school. And we can't afford for me to be off from my job.
Yeah.
Also, in that same accident, Emilio's father is killed.
That's
And
true.
so,
Yeah.
Emilio, before even this accident, is already navigating issues of food insecurity.
Yep.
Also, that they look to be in a school where at least English is the predominant language spoken, and
Right.
it is not his parents' first language. And so
Yeah.
there are going to be some issues of language and culture that he has to work through as well.
Mhm.
But then on top of that, also dealing with the loss of his father.
And then I think about not just the school aspect of language and culture, but what if Emilio speaks very good English and his parents do not, and he is kind of more Americanized than they would like or than they are. So you're dealing with different cultures within the same household. If Emilio has kind of Americanized himself and to fit into the school environment, that's a completely different thing too. So he's navigating so many different things. And then even think about Adrian. You could look at him just as a traditional bully, right? But look at what he potentially has going on at home and dealing with a mother who is a wheelchair user and what that is like for him as somebody helping his mom navigate that since he was 6 or 7 years old. That could be a big weight to carry as well. And so you see somebody in one lens, and I think we have to remember that there's so many layers to a person, whether it's disability or something else.
Absolutely. Well, hey, let's
Yeah.
move on and talk about Legally Blind, which I will say was my favorite of the stories in here.
Oh,
Favorite's a
cool.
weird way to to
Yeah,
describe it, but
no,
it
I
was the
get what you're
story that
saying.
stood out the most. Yeah, it was the story that to me stood out the most in communicating the complicated feelings the creator here has about his own life. And so this is Legally
Mm-hmm.
Blind. It was written and drawn and colored by Richard Fairgray. And it starts with a plate at a restaurant. Sitting on this plate are two eyeballs. And we learn pretty quickly that this man is on a date. And one of the two characters in our depiction here is eating the eyeballs, which, sounds gross, obviously. It's not quite so visceral and gory on the page. And by the
Mm-hmm.
way, I should say, I'll put up samples of the art from these different stories on our Instagram account at Graphic Novel Apostle, as we always do. And I would really encourage you to go take a look at some of these because the visual manners in which these creators chose to display or express the types of disability issues they're dealing with was really remarkable.
Yeah, for sure.
But one of the things we get to very fast in both the dialogue and in the narration that goes along with it, the dialogue starts up really the first we see of these characters talking is the character who has legal blindness is explaining to his date what that entails. How
Mm-hmm.
he's able to, see about 3% out of one eye and nothing out of the other, and that makes him legally blind. And so they're having this conversation, and of course, the man who he's with responds saying, "Amazing what you can do considering," which
Mm,
I don't know, seems like a normal reaction, but probably is not a pleasant reaction from the
sure.
point of view of the character who's explaining it. And there's a text box right at the bottom that just says, "And that's when I know I'm not having sex tonight." And
Yeah.
what we see over the next couple of pages is this creator's expression of some of the emotional aspects of dealing with
Yeah.
his disability.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think frustration too is an emotional thing that I just jumped out at me because I'm thinking they're making a really valid point in terms of legally blind and being considered blind and that where is the line there. And sometimes you're an inspiration like he was to this date that is not great, right? Sometimes you're an inspiration and oh my god, I can't believe that you can do all of these things considering. And we talk about this all the time in the disability community too. It's something called inspiration porn. I don't know if you ever heard that term, but
Never heard
um
the term, but I think I understand what you're telling me.
yeah. And it's like, why am I inspirational for doing things that anybody else would be doing? Like, anybody else goes to work every day and puts on their pants every day and goes on dates, sucky dates, good dates, whatever. Like, why am I
Hmm.
inspirational for just doing everyday things, for just living my life, you know? And so
Yeah,
that's the thing there. Like, why is it an inspiration that I'm doing anything that you would be doing? And
sure.
then so you're either an inspiration or like you're pitied, or it's like
Hmm.
poor you, and you kind of see that in this story as well, and that's problematic too. And so just going through the frustration of that and figuring out where you fit and feeling like you don't fit anywhere. You don't fit in the blind community necessarily, and you don't fit in the fully able-bodied community. So where do you fit? So I felt all of that when reading this story.
Yeah, the thing that stood out most to me here about this character's disappointment, just on the first page of this story, is that he realizes, and I'm sure this is not a first realization. I think it's a realizes again that the way this date is starting out is that he does not get to be just another person
Yeah,
sitting across the table.
yeah,
He's
for
going to
sure.
become defined by his
Mm-hmm.
disability,
Mm-hmm.
for his date. Over time, that's something I'm sure, you work past and work through, but in just meeting a new person for the first
Yeah.
time, he just wants to have all the, fluttery, excited feelings in his tummy of any good first date. And
Mm-hmm.
instead, he's thinking about how this man here is going to be either afraid to approach me like I'm something broken,
Yeah.
or is going to look at me like I'm, some inspirational story, but either way is not going to see me as just me.
It's just me, yeah. And I also thought about, like, in this story, when do you even have the conversation of, like, I'm a disabled person? That's a thing too that I
Mhm.
thought about in this story. Like, do you do that on the first date? And what, like, anxiety that must be. Like, when do I actually tell somebody that this is a thing I navigate because of that very thing you just said? That's going to be your first and likely only impression of me, or the impression that sticks with you most, rather than just me. So when do I actually bring that up in the conversation?
Yeah. Well, and presumably these guys have at least communicated, maybe online or something like that, maybe through somebody who was setting them up or something like that. But it does appear
Mm-hmm.
this is their first meeting, and so I imagine it must have been a question that this character had to deal with in saying, okay, you know, so that maybe we can move past this right when we first meet. Do I
Yeah.
do I say, hey, I deal with legal blindness
Yeah.
ahead of time, or is it a surprise, and should it be a surprise? I mean, that's a really tell me in the clients that you work with,
Yeah.
how do a lot of people navigate those types of questions?
It's hard. I remember a specific memory is coming to mind with working with a student, actually, because you do accommodations work, and I don't know if many people think of like this, but you think you go in to somebody has ADHD, they have physical disability, whatever it is, and so you think you're going to go in, assess what accommodations they need, get to know them in that way, and then you just go from there. You get the accommodation set up, and then that's it, right? Oftentimes that is not how it happens. It turns into a whole counseling session sometimes, even if it's not intended to be. And so those skills are super important, and students get comfortable with you and get to know you and want to share their life. And so I remember years ago having a conversation with a student about who was a wheelchair user, about dating, and who would want to date them and have to deal with, quote unquote, all of that comes with that. And that was their fear. And even if they're navigating dating online, when do you tell someone? You can hide your chair in pictures online if you get creative with it, but when does that has to come up in the conversation before you meet, because when they meet you they're going to see the chair, right? So when do you have those conversations? And I mean, and it was that conversation with that student was a really hard one and a really hard day because there's no right answer to that, right? There's no perfect timing. There's none of that. You just have to do it when it feels right for you. And then if that person is for you or interested, they'll be interested in all of you, and all that you have to offer. But that's really easy for me to say sitting on the other side of it and not having to experience that, right? So those are very, very difficult conversations because there are no concrete, clear answers in terms of this is how you should approach it.
Sure. As we continue through this story, the author takes us back to early in his life when he was just a boy. And we
Mm-hmm.
see all of these different images where, he's narrating to us through text boxes about different experiences he had growing up. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting that I, wouldn't have occurred to me as being someone who's never had to walk in this creator's shoes
Yeah.
is that sometimes he had sort of an imposter syndrome among kids with total blindness.
Yeah.
And then also feeling self-conscious about being able to see certain things, and maybe someone
Mm-hmm.
would think he was faking
Faking it.
his disability
Yeah.
because he's in a movie theater or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, like you're not disabled enough. Like again, you don't fit
Right.
in any spectrum. You're not disabled enough and you're not fully able-bodied enough either. So what are you? Where do you fit? And so many of the folks that I work with as students and in my private practice work have talked about feeling that same way of having to prove that you are disabled and all the hoops
Hmm.
that you have to jump through to kind of prove to other people that you are in fact disabled enough, and that's exhausting. So just dealing with a world who's not built for you is exhausting enough, and then when people don't believe you, that in of itself creates just extra layers of things when you're already navigating so much. So yeah, that's a very common feeling.
And this storyteller also reveals to us some other frustrations that left me as a reader without the types of disabilities that this creator has, almost feeling like how could I win in
Mm,
dealing with this person and their disability? And that sounds crass. I mean, I'm the reader, so it's hard not to make it about
yeah,
me,
yeah, for sure, for
for at
sure.
least for this moment, as I'm trying to understand him. He talks about new friends that always want to take him hiking to where you get to see this beautiful vista, and yeah, they know that he has some level of vision and might be able to see it, but he's frustrated because he's gone on this long hike and now he can't see anything.
Uh-huh.
Or he talks about how his mom sometimes when he was a kid would, at least in his perception, whether this was what his mom was thinking or not, using his disability as a way to sort of cut through the crowds a little quicker if she was running behind or late or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. And whether or not his mom ever meant that, he sure perceived it to be that way, and that would,
Sure.
would be an issue of offense.
Yeah.
But then going back as well to the date that he was on at the beginning, where this guy shows up to a date and says, "Oh, I can see that you have disability in terms of your eyes." And as they're starting to have this conversation, I'm sure it's hard for the date to know how to react. It's like, what
Yeah.
what is the correct response?
Yeah, that is hard to navigate, especially as people in your life who don't have to experience it. And I think probably the best way is just to ask people like what they, if it's something they want to talk about, or what does that look like for you. So like, don't make assumptions about what you think the person needs or wants, or what you think their experience is. Just what does that look like for you, and is that an important aspect of your life? And then based on what they tell you, you go with that and you make those adjustments where you need to. Like if I told you I can't navigate stairs and you know that as my friend, then don't invite me to go hiking, because if I can't navigate stairs, I'm probably not going to do too hot at hiking. You know what I mean? And so those are
Sure,
things that
sure.
you just have to,
Roots
you
could be a
just want,
problem.
exactly. You just want to be considered based on the information that I've shared with somebody. Like, for example, one of my very good friends, now, mind you, I don't live with them at all. Will probably visit their house a limited number of times. But when they were moving into their new apartment, the new apartment has a lot of stairs. And so one of the things that they did, which I thought was super nice, but like not necessary, is when they went to tour the apartment, FaceTimed me so that I could see the stairs and asked, if you were to come and visit me, would these be difficult to navigate? And I was like, that is so nice. But
Okay.
also, I don't live with you. Like, I pick an apartment because you love the apartment. And whenever I come to visit, we'll figure the rest of it out. But that is an example of like, just the person considers you because of what they know. And it's second nature to them. It's not something you have to remind them of. Like, they were proactive in considering you in the first place. And sometimes that's all people want. It doesn't have to be a big conversation, it doesn't have to be all those things. You just want to be considered based on the information that you have about me and my life and my experience.
Yeah. So I understand that no group is a monolith. And
Yeah.
so I'm not certainly in asking some of these questions, please, I'm not trying to say, hey, can you please speak for, all
Yeah,
people
for
with
sure.
disabilities or whatever. But
There's no way,
do you
right?
do you have a sense though? Right, absolutely. Do you have a sense though? Because I think a lot of people who don't have disabilities, um, and are of good-natured people, people of goodwill,
Yeah.
want to know the proper way to interact with somebody when they can see that they have a disability or their disability becomes obvious. I think back to when I was in law school, I had a classmate who had hands but did not have arms.
Mm,
His hands came just right out from his shoulders, and he and I and a couple other friends went to a movie one night, and I was driving. And so he gets in the passenger seat, and we didn't know each other very well at this point. We're still pretty early in being classmates, and he's reaching over to get the seatbelt, and going across for it. And I sat there for just a moment and kind of hesitated, and then said,
yeah.
"Hey, can I give you a hand with that? Would that be okay?" And he was like, "Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
Please
for
help me with
sure.
this seatbelt.
For sure.
That makes life easier." But at the same time, I was reluctant because I didn't want to offend him
Yeah,
and
for sure.
treat him like this is something you can't do for yourself.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a lot of people have that kind of trepidation when approaching conversation with somebody
Yeah.
with disability. Do you have sort of advice that you give to people about that topic?
Yeah, it's gonna sound really groundbreaking. No, it's not. Not really. Um, just ask. Just do what you
Mhm,
did and ask. And if people tell you they don't need your help, believe them.
mhm.
And if
Is
they
that
do
generally pretty
want it,
welcome?
yeah, yeah, if they do want it, they will let you know, you know? And so I think there's nothing wrong with asking, right? At all. Just as a human being, it's a kind person. You want to ask, like, do you need some help? And if they say, no, I got it, like, believe them. And I think sometimes the problem comes when you're insistent that they must need help, right? Are you sure you don't need help? Are you sure I can't help you in some way? I've said no, so just accept my no,
Mhm,
right? Or I've said
yeah.
yeah, sure, like your classmate did. I think you just treat people like humans. And what would you do for anyone else that looked like they were struggling, and it didn't look like a disability related thing? They just looked like they were maybe having a hard time or maybe needed some help with something. Like, what would you do with that individual?
Yeah.
So do the same thing, and then whatever's people's answer to that is, you accept that for what it is, for the truth, you know? Because I think Most people, not everyone, but a lot of people have been navigating their conditions for some time. So you figured out how to do it, and you figured out how to do it in a way that works for you. So sometimes people are like, no, I got it. And other times people are like, sure, I could use some help. So I would say just trust people when they tell you what they tell you, and there's no shame in asking questions. The shame is in assuming that we know what people want and need,
Mm,
and then going off of that. Yeah.
that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate you talking through that. Let's go to the last story that we had picked out to
Yeah.
talk through, and that is Step by Step. And this is a story about a man navigating life with fibromyalgia. Early on in this, we talked about the concept of invisible disabilities, and I think
Mm-hmm.
this is such a great example here
It
of the
is.
type of disability that, first of all, it's a condition that is not as commonly understood
Mm-hmm.
as some other types of conditions are. I think a lot of times when I think about invisible disabilities, I think about things like depression
Yeah.
or migraine headaches.
Mm-hmm.
Things that we all understand on some level, even if we don't understand the depth or the impact of them.
Sure.
But when you talk about a condition like fibromyalgia, especially where, this creator in this story, Step by Step, and by the way, the writer here is C.K. Carpenter, the artist is Mike Morrocco, and Aubrey Lynn Jeppson did the lettering again for this story. For this character, the fibromyalgia seemed to be something that came upon him in adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is not for the people who are his coworkers and, his parents that he ends up dealing with a bit too in this story. This isn't what they're used to experiencing
Yeah.
with this person.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard for him to explain how suddenly he has absolutely no energy, even though he
Yeah.
tried to sleep all night, and why he's in such great pain because the people around him can't see any of this.
Mm-hmm.
They just see a person that they seem to know is interacting in the perfectly regular ways through life,
Yeah.
now having, like this great burden is upon him. And yet their eyes tell them nothing different about that.
Right. Right. It's so interesting. In the beginning, I think I talked about working with clients who have disabilities that they were born with and those that are acquired, which is what this person is experiencing. And that is a completely different perspective for the family and for the person versus if it's something that you have dealt with your entire life. So I could see a lot of that in how the family dealt with him. Again, like you were saying, a couple of years ago, this was not you. And so I don't understand this transition because, again, it's something that came up on him versus something that he's dealt with forever.
Yeah. Well, and in this story too, you can tell that this character is really motivated to want to get his life back to as normal as it can be, or
Yeah.
pre-onset of
Yeah.
his disability. And it seems like he is very concerned with other people's perception that
Mm.
he is malingering, basically.
Mm-hmm.
That all of a sudden, what, you can't work because you're tired all the time? You're what is this? How am I supposed to understand this?
Mm-hmm.
And, also he talks about how fibromyalgia is not a condition that was well understood 20-25 years ago.
Yeah.
And when he is first diagnosed in the setting of our story, it's back in those mid-aughts period of time where this is still a condition that is really being newly understood.
Mm-hmm.
And he goes through a whole bunch of doctors who can't tell him anything that's wrong with him. And so I'm sure he starts having his own doubts about, is there really anything wrong with me? Or am I just being, I don't know, soft on myself? He knows he's in pain. And
Yeah.
so, I'm sure that there's that. Boy, reassurance sounds like a funny way to say it, but essentially that reassurance. And then finally, he gets a diagnosis and he has a name for it, fibromyalgia. And that
Mm-hmm.
is just something that he is happy to have because at least he can better explain himself to other people.
Yeah, and it's proof. It's proof that you're not faking it. It brings me back to the fully blind and legally blind like story that we were just talking about. If I have that paper and if I have that diagnosis, it's proof that I wasn't faking it the whole time. and that there
Hmm.
really is something going on. And so it's proof for himself, I think, because like you said, you start like questioning your own self and how real this is. So it's proof for the character, and also in a way proof for his family and everybody around him that have had questions and that are not really taking him as seriously as they should be. And it is exhausting to need proof and to have it
Hmm.
for people to believe your story and believe your experience, but it does legitimize it in a way for the folks around you sometimes.
Sure. There is a single page in this story that I really loved and
Yeah.
will be one of the samples of the art that I include on our Instagram page. But it almost looks like Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. You have this man just standing with his kind of arms out to his side a little bit, and the way he is chosen to represent fibromyalgia almost looks like a pink version of Spider-Man's webs
Uh-huh.
that are wrapping around his arms and going out to the side, wrapping around his neck and kind of going up out of the corner of the screen, wrapping around his ankles and doing the same. And the text on this page tells us that fibromyalgia has three major components: chronic widespread pain in at least 4 of 5 body regions. The pain causes a sleep disturbance as the brain constantly wakes up during the night. And this leads to extreme fatigue, regardless of how much or how little you sleep.
Mm-hmm.
What a way to better understand this condition.
Lit-
And now if
literally.
I met somebody today, I've heard of fibromyalgia. I did not know what it was. I understood
Yeah.
it to be, some sort of autoimmune type condition, and I'm
Sure.
not sure whether
Mm-hmm.
that's accurate or inaccurate.
Yes.
But
Mm-hmm.
after reading something like this, I mean, these creators have done a service here, not only in telling their own story, but for me as a reader now, if I encounter somebody who says I have fibromyalgia, I may not be up for going out, to this dinner you've invited me to.
Yeah.
I know now, hey, maybe I don't need to take that as, an excuse.
If right.
Maybe I can
Right.
understand a little better that, like, this person is facing challenges I'm not thinking about.
Yeah. And that description is just so well done. It's just like pain everywhere and discomfort everywhere,
Yeah.
you know. And that is the reality of some people's experience. And I think it just teaches us in this comic to just not believe people. You might not see it and you might not fully understand it, but and this gives us an idea, but just believe people when they tell you that this is what's going on with my body, with my brain, and this is my experience, because he's already exhausted enough. And now to have to go explain it to everybody is even more exhausting. So just
Yeah.
believe people when they tell you what their experience is. And so I really, this is one of my favorite stories actually. And you know, when you think about all the hoops that the character has to jump through with doctors, think about how expensive that is and how exhausting that is.
Mhm.
When you think about, I think in the story he talked about having to hire a lawyer to get disability. Think about how
Mhm.
expensive that is and how exhausting that is, and all the things you got to go through just to again prove that this is my experience. And not only that, but I've made some notes here about all of these stories, but with this one I was also thinking about, the loss of your normal, right? And the loss of
Mhm.
a job that you really cared about and you really loved and wanted to do, and not being able to do that, and how many of us kind of define ourselves by the work that we do. Maybe we shouldn't do that, right? But how many of us do that? And so when that work is taken away from you, then who are you if you can't do the work that you love so much, or if you can't do the things that you're always used to doing? And so now he's got to come to grips with that. Moving back in with his parents, like there were so many layers to this story. And I was
Mhm.
just thinking to myself, like I love my parents. I'm here visiting my parents now, but I don't know that I want to live back at home. you know um and the reality of having to do that because you have no choice, not because you wanted
Mhm.
to, but because this is what you have to do right now for yourself, and just losing that level of independence. I mean, it was just so much in this story, to be honest. I really enjoyed it a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, another complication that this character talks to us about is at the time when he first acquires fibromyalgia, there aren't good medications that are available.
Mm-mm.
And he talks about turning to alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
to numb some of this pain, and I'm sure probably to deal with some of the depression that comes along
Yeah.
with moving back in with his parents,
Yep.
losing a job that had been meaningful to him. And then he talks about Lyrica, I think, is the medication that
Uh-huh.
had been approved by the FDA that ended up making a big difference for him.
Yep.
But you mentioned him having to hire a lawyer to deal with getting disability benefits and
Yeah.
prove his disability. Then he, as a positive turn in the story, says, once I was able to get some of these medications figured out in the right amount and right dosage, I could work again. He
Yeah.
said, it's 8 hours a week. I can't
Yep.
work full time, but I can work again. But that triggers in my mind too the reality that that probably also complicates his benefits situation.
Yeah, yeah, because you can only
And,
work so
you
much.
know, that's right. There are going to be certain limits on how much he can work and still
Mhm,
maintain disability benefits,
mhm,
which,
mhm.
they're issues you can work through, but it's yet another issue that this man has
Is
to
yet
work through.
just another thing, and then that makes me think about, living with his parents again and going back to that because I think he identifies as LGBTQ plus, and his parents are very, very religious, and so now in a way you're going back into the closet, whatever that looks like, because you have to move back in with these
Right.
religious parents who are not super supportive. And so you talked about in the beginning the intersectionality of people's lived experiences, and so many of these stories had that component in it, but this one did as well, dealing with disability and LGBTQ plus issues, and the intersection of that, and dealing with those two things at the same time is a lot. Dealing with one of them is enough.
Hmm.
But imagine having two or three or four
Sure.
other compounding things. And then we bring in substance abuse because we're self medicating, because there is no other way to medicate at this point. And so you're just navigating so many different layers.
Yeah. My goodness. To all the creators who worked on this project, and there are, like 8 other stories in here that we didn't touch on at all, but to every one of the creators who worked on this project, thank you. To the editors who put
Yes.
this book together and ran the Kickstarter, thank you. This was a really meaningful and really cool experience to get to read this and to think about other people's life experiences in ways that we don't see.
Yeah. And for me, I want to say thank you as well. Thank you to Mark for recommending it, but also thank you to the creators because, again, this is my first time reading a novel like this. And so I'm just happy to be introduced to something like this. And this was a great introduction. And as a person that works with folks with disabilities, and as a person who identifies as disabled myself, I was happy to see stories that centered disabled characters and the complexity of disability, and it not being all rainbows, and it also not being all doom and gloom, because it's not that
Hmm.
either. It is a layered community with complex, experiences, and ideas about disability pride, right? We have a disability pride month, right? But everybody doesn't feel the pride because navigating disability is tough in an able-bodied world. But there are moments that you do feel pride. And I think it's okay for those two things to coexist, you know? And so thank you for writing
Yeah.
stories where pride and struggle coexist.
100%. 100%. And Dominique, where can people, if they could benefit from the services that you offer at Beyond Barriers Telehealth Practice, where can people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can follow me on Facebook or Instagram at Beyond Barriers Telehealth Practice, and you can contact me there, and then I will point you to how to get connected with my services. It is completely remote therapy because I try to be as accessible as possible. And while remote options create barriers within themselves, I do think that it creates more accessibility for more people, and so it is a completely remote practice. And so if you're interested, find me on Instagram or Facebook and we'll get connected.
And Dominique, do patients need to be within the boundaries of Arkansas
That is a great
to work
question.
with you?
Yeah, so I'm only licensed in the state of Arkansas. So if you're in the state of Arkansas, I can work with you anywhere in the state. I take insurance and private pay clients as well. So a plethora of different types of insurances. And if I can't work with you because you happen not to be in the state, I never let someone walk away empty handed. So I'm going to give you some referrals to go somewhere to get the support that you need.
That's wonderful. Dominique, first of all, I did not realize that you were already at home as we're recording this. This is the 23rd of December. I didn't realize you were at your parents' house. Thank you for taking
You're
time away from your
fine.
family to talk to me.
You're
Oh my
welcome.
goodness.
No problem. Listen, sometimes you need to get away.
Well, we're going to see my parents after Christmas, and so I may be calling you back sometime next week
Right?
in trying to get away for a little bit. But I always love working with you over the last 6 years that you and I
Yeah.
have worked together on and off, and I'm so thankful that you would come on the podcast too and share with me and share with our listening audience. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for asking. I always enjoy it as well. And now I'm not so nervous when you call at the office and need something. Then I know it's not always that we've done something wrong. So I've calmed down a little now.
Oh, you know, I actually do get that quite a bit. People are like, "I saw it was your number," and I was a little bit nervous. And I call about good things sometimes
You
too.
do. You do.
Sometimes it's because the plane has crashed into the mountain, but sometimes not.
For the listening audience, sometimes it's good stuff.
That's right. Hey, and also for our listeners, I ought to say this more, and I always forget to, but hey, please help other people find this show by going to wherever you get your podcasts from. Leave me a star rating, or if it's one that you can, type in a little written review. Let the world know how great the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast is. Let them know it's the best podcast on the internet. Friends, thank you all for being here with us. As always, we will look forward to seeing you again for our next episode next week, or I think we're going to get back on our Batman the Long Halloween series. We've been away from that one for just a little while. And until then, keep reading those comics.